ReefDudes is sponsored by Ecotech Marine and Bulk Reef Supply.
Today we're answering Chris's questions on the essentials of switching from a freshwater tank to a saltwater tank. What's going on, guys? Devin from ReefDudes. Now, there is definitely more freshwater hobbyists than saltwater out in the world, and there's lots of people that want to make that jump from fresh to salt, and it can seem very overwhelming at first. So Chris wrote in and was asking for some kind of recommendations on what are the essentials, what do you need to start a saltwater tank and kind of bridge that gap from freshwater to saltwater. Now, in essence, there's not a big difference between a freshwater and a saltwater tank, except for the fact that you add salt to it. Now, one of the biggest things to know, as with a freshwater tank, you have evaporation. Water evaporates, you add some more fresh water to top it off. Now, a saltwater tank is very similar, but the thing you gotta know is water evaporates and salt doesn't. So as water evaporates, your salinity, aka the salt concentration, is going to increase. So you wanna make sure you're always keeping up with your top off water so that your salinity doesn't climb up inside of the tank. Now, you can either manually do this. If you have just a standard aquarium, you can just have a little mark on there, and as you see it go down, you can add some more water to the tank. Or you can get something called an auto top off, which is a little sensor and a pump that will automatically add more fresh water to the tank as required. Now, like a freshwater tank, lighting, that really depends what you want to keep in the tank. If it's a fish only tank, you can pretty much use anything you want for lights. Your freshwater ones might be just fine. Now, if you want to get into the coral side, that's where you want to start looking at different things, because the saltwater lights are a little heavier on the blue spectrum, and that's more what the corals want inside of the tank. So you may be able to use your current one for fish only. When you decide to bridge to corals, you can look at potentially upgrading your lights later on. Heaters, again, those are going to be fairly universal and work with either way. Now, the one other consideration is flow inside the tank. I know with freshwater, you don't necessarily have power heads or wave makers as much inside of the tank. Usually your canister filter, your aqua-clear, whatever is doing that for you. Now, you can probably get away with that for some stuff, but generally saltwater fish are used to living with more current, so you want to get something like a wave maker. Now, wave maker is basically a propeller style pump that puts a current or pulses or waves within the aquarium, and that creates a more natural environment for your fish. And that is basically the essentials to get a tank going. Now, if we're talking about aquascape in the tank, in a freshwater tank, generally you have your aquarium, gravel, and some decorations. If you're more into the planted tanks, what I used to be into, you have some kind of a soil substrate, and you have your plants inside of there. Now, in a saltwater tank, it's basically, there could be sand or no sand, and there's the rock. Now, the rock is your surface area for bacteria. That's kind of similar in freshwater as well, so that surface area is what you need for that bacteria to colonize on. Now, for cycling the tank, similar things. It takes 3 or 4 weeks. You can use bottle bacteria, speed it up, tank is cycled, and it'll be a happy place to add your fish to the tank. Now, there's going to become a point where you're going to want to start adding coral to your tank. I'm personally really addicted to the coral. I just love all those natural, wonderful colors in the tank, and I think that's a huge appeal to me. Now, if you have done planted tanks and you are used to dosing fertilizers for your plants, that's really similar to what you do for saltwater corals. There's 3 main elements you got to worry about: calcium, alkalinity, magnesium. And once they start being consumed by corals growing and crusting, you can re-top them off into the tank. Now, again, you can do this manually by just manually adding some in, do a test kit, once a week and top off as required. Or if you want to automate it, you can get a dosing pump. And this is a pump you can program to dose so many mils per day for you of said solution to keep things stable. So there really is a lot of parallels, especially if you're looking at something like a high-tech planted tank versus a saltwater tank. Now, when it comes to dosing supplementation, you do have many different options there. Dosing those 3 elements is probably your simplest start for it. Now, there is other methods that are also fairly easy. There's a 1-part dosing one you can do, calcium formate, which is basically one solution that will dose all 3, and that's a great way to go for a smaller system. If you're doing a bigger system, then that gets a little more expensive. Another popular method is using kalkwasser, and kalkwasser is something that some people you could put in your auto top off, and as it replaces that water, it doses your tank as well. Super simple, but it is a little harder on your pump, so it requires a bit more maintenance. I'm personally a fan of using a kalkwasser reactor, so it's just a little chamber that you can force water through with a dosing pump. That way it's more consistent, controllable, and it's very predictable results that way. Now, this is getting a little bit advanced, so back to the basics. The other question too I see all the time is tank size. Do you go small or do you go big? So the way I look at it, if you do like a small, like a 20-gallon tank, you can do, if you keep up with the weekly water changes, it's going to be a very easy tank. Most people say go big, and I'm going to say it depends on your lifestyle, your schedule, everything else. But if you have a 20-gallon tank and you do a 5-gallon weekly water change, that is going to keep your tank in a very happy place. You're basically replacing all the water every month, and honestly, it's going to eliminate almost any problem you're going to have. If you're keeping basic corals, your water changes are basically do your dosing for you, and you're going to have to dose very little. If you start doing cresting corals, you might have to top off a little bit of dosing, but not very much. So a small tank and a regular water change is actually very, very easy. Now, it also depends on the type of fish you want. If you want bigger fish like tangs, you need a larger tank. Usually people go for that kind of 120 to 200 gallon range. Personally, if you're keeping tangs, I like a 6-foot tank, and that's what this one is. This is a 6-foot peninsula tank. And a big thing with tangs is the swimming space. But if you're sticking to a lot of the smaller fish, then you have a ton of different options. Now, if you already have a freshwater tank, can you use it? Absolutely. I see this one come up all the time. So with some of the larger systems, there's just a standard tank, which you can absolutely use as a saltwater tank. The only kind of slight downfall is a lot of your equipment you're going to see in the tank. So what a lot of people do is they'll drill a tank, or they'll buy a saltwater ready tank, which basically means there's return and overflow pipes. So that essentially goes to a small tank underneath the big tank. There's another system down here, and at the end of the day, it's really just a spot to hide all of your equipment. It's so you don't see, all your filtration and all your stuff in the tank. It just leaves like a pristine viewing experience. Now, if you want a simpler method, there's all-in-one style tanks. And those are basically a regular tank, but they have a chamber in the back. So it's basically a wall in the back of the tank with some chambers. And that's kind of your spot to hide all of your gear. So it's like you have a tiny sump in the back without the hassle of plumbing. And again, one of the biggest advantages with that is it's just a place to hide all of your equipment to keep your tank looking pristine. Now, that being said, my very first saltwater tank, I converted a 12-gallon fluval edge over. I had a cobalt neotherm super thin heater I hid in the back behind the rockwork, had one tiny Corley nano power head in there, and that was it. Super duper simple. I had the aqua clear filter. I put in a little bag of ChemiPure Blue, which is a carbon, and a little bit of GFO. That was it. Super duper simple. So it does not need to be complicated. Now, that being said, it can be as simple or as complicated as you like. And that's kind of one of the beauties of the hobby. And after all, it is a hobby. So hopefully this helped you guys out and give you kind of the basics on going from a freshwater to a saltwater tank. If you have any specifics you want me to dig into, let me know in the comments below. If this helped you, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and that bell. I'll catch you guys on the next video.